Good morning and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today we are doing part 2 of our session. We just completed the first part and we do have the same audience in the room, so you will see that in just a second. We're gonna have one little change. But what we're talking is Last Call Forum 2019. Every August, I run a forum in 4 different states throughout 4 different parts of the state. In Portland, Augusta, Orono, and Presque Isle, and we've got a different topic every year. 2017, it started with inquiry. 2018 was disciplinary literacy. 2019 was assessment. And 2020 is scheduled for inquiry 2.0, and will probably have to be a virtual online environment, but still look for Forum 2020, so tentatively being planned. And so at the end of that year, I always come back one last time in June for participants who are unable to attend in August and do a last call. And because of the current situation, we're doing that digitally. So part 1 talked about inquiry and thinking, how to assess student inquiry and thinking. Part 2 right now, we're going to talk about speaking and listening and reading and writing. So what we learned in the first session, and again, you're going to get a little bit of a refresher, but if you want more of the deeper dive, if you're hearing this for the first time and did not listen to part 1, please go back and watch that first part, because we talked a little bit more about the research behind history is more than just names and dates. And I think that's something as educators that we understand. And the research for more than 20 years has shown that, especially starting back in the 90s, Sam Weinberg at Stanford, working with San Francisco Public Schools, did a lot of work in what's now known as Stanford History Education Group around document-based questions. So we're talking about SHEG and DBQs to start using our acronyms. And actually one of his grad students at the time is in the upper left corner, Chauncey Montesano. She was instrumental in that work as well, and she's at the University of Michigan as the co-founder and director of Read, Inquire, Write. Their research, along with top middle Jeffrey Noakes at BYU with upper elementary students. Bottom right, Abby Reisman. I can't remember her university right now, but she did her work with middle school students. Joel Breakstone in the upper right, he did his doctoral work when he was at Stanford working for SHEG. He did HATS, Historical Assessments of Thinking. And then in the bottom middle, we have Bruce Van Sledwright. And so all of this work, again, so we catch there's different grade spans. Bruce has done some of his work in elementary school, and then you'll see some of the high school stuff. Jeffrey Noakes in upper elementary school, Abby Reisman in middle school. The Read, Inquire, Write that Chauncey Montesano is currently doing is middle school, but in her webinar, she joined us on Tuesday. You can see that posted on the professional learning page. She did give examples about how it could be incorporated in both elementary and high school as well. But all of this work that we keep hearing about is the grounding for what we're going to talk about today. And we're really going to focus on Kathy Swan, S.G. Grant, and John Lee, and some of their research in how to assess social studies. And then on the right-hand side there, we have John Hattie, who talks about the effect size of different educational pieces. And he has written a book around the visible learning series, including the assessment capable visible learner. So we're going to be talking about all of that work. We would be joining breakout rooms, but as I alluded to a little bit ago, we have the same participants in this. And in part 1 of this session, they did a jigsaw activity where they went into different breakout rooms and they looked at these 5 different pieces from the white paper written by Grant, Swan, and Lee in 2015 around social studies assessments. And I'll give you the overview here in just a second. But if you want to know more about that, I'd encourage you to go back and watch part 1 of the Last Call Forum 2019 session, where we had the participants actually do a jigsaw. And at the end of that jigsaw, what we learned is that there's some issues that we have in assessing social studies. There are some benefits, and what we see is that the best, most accurate way to assess students is a classroom-based assessment with individual teachers working with their classes. So that kind of works against the idea of standardized statewide tests. And there's also the issue when you're working with individual teachers that there's some problems facing in how to get those standardized across even just a building or a hallway or a team of people. How do you get everybody on the same page? How do we make sure that they're assessing in a valid way? And then how do we make sure that we're actually assessing the things that people would want assessed? Because the different stakeholders in the room of social studies assessment do have different ideas of what to look at. So at the end of when we did this in the first session, I said you can basically sum up. The question is, what should we be assessing and how should we be assessing it? And I said you can sum it up in one word, and that one word is inconclusive. That there are pros and cons to a lot of things, and that in the end there is no one way to approach the work. And that in having the opportunity to work with a lot of the people here, a lot of the authors of social studies books, not listed here, Bruce Lesh, he being, if you include him as well, if you talk with these individuals, they will talk about the use of primary sources. They will talk about disciplinary literacy. They will talk about moving beyond names and dates. And then they will also say that their stuff is just part of the solution, that you can't DBQ a kid every day. Bruce will say you can't history lab a kid every day. Joel will say you can't do hats every day. None of these is the way to assess a student. They're all just part of the way. And so I like to start the piece around assessments with that, is that the intent of this session is not well, here's how you do it. Do this step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4, and then you're all done. It's that understanding of there's so many different ways to approach it. And that's why I broke this into assessing part 1, inquiry and thinking. And then part 2 here, we're talking about speaking, listening, reading, and writing. There are different components that we need to be assessing when it comes to students. There are different ways to be addressing those different ideas. And then you really still do have to, again, there is the benefit of you as a classroom teacher and understanding your students and being able to work with that. So I spend a lot of time talking about formative assessments, again, because there is not the one end-all, be-all summative assessment at the end. And so if we start to look at some of the reading, let me start here with the reading right? Okay. If we look at some of the things we want to do, if we're talking about the primary sources, because all the research says that you really want to get engaged with primary sources. And then in the last session, we did talk about my hands-on history session, which also is a separate webinar that you can check out. Sometimes it's just really simple, and you can still do it as multiple choice. And I want to be very clear in that there's a little bit of a bias against multiple choice because that it doesn't assess things accurately, right? It's not very rigorous. But that's only if we do it in the traditional idea of, a correct answer, 2 kind of close distractors, and then Mickey Mouse, right, is D. Like, who was the first president of the United States? George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, or Mickey Mouse, right? That's kind of that typical setup. But you can still do multiple choice questions that still get at historical thinking. So you can give a kid a document, let's just say the Gettysburg Address, and you can help put it into context by giving them other questions, a multiple choice question. So we said, okay, we've now read the Gettysburg Address. Which question might it connect to? A, the role of the North in the Civil War. B, how enslaved peoples escaped or how they fought. C, the economic impact of the war. D, the personal connections. I'm sorry, I'm making this up as I'm going along, right? But you're still practicing the skill of contextualization by giving students choices that you would look back through those questions. You can do a close reader contextualization. You can give them, and I'm gonna show you a website that has a bunch of these. You can give them a primary source and say, what did Abraham Lincoln think about in terms of the Civil War? Which of the following statements from the Gettysburg Address best showed his feelings? Was it A, and then you put in a quote, B, put in a quote, C, put in a quote, etc. That's still forcing kids to go back, do a close read of the document, find where that statement was, pull in the contextual evidence of it, think about the entire document, go back to the question, and then they have to compare all those different lines. Which of these is the best piece? You can do it in terms of a bigger piece. If you're studying multiple things outside of just the Gettysburg Address, you could say, what other document is this similar to? Is it similar to this speech? Is it similar to this document? Is it similar to this? Or you can do that contradicts. And you're practicing the skills of corroboration. You don't have to have the kids write a full essay. You can have them say, the Gettysburg Address is most similar to A, B, C, D. They're still having to corroborate information. The one document that, or the Gettysburg Address contradicts which of these, right? You're still practicing that still. You can still do the sourcing component of it. The Gettysburg Address was given by, right? And there's your kind of more of your traditional multiple choice, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, whatever. But if you've got all that sourcing information up, you can still have kids do it. So I want to be very clear starting off that in this piece, there is a lot of room for using multiple choice. The last session, you heard me talk a lot about, like, I really don't care what the student has for an answer. I just want to know their thinking. And in this case, I'm looking for those right answers to help us back into that thinking component, but being very clear that just because it's a multiple choice does not mean it's not rigorous and does not mean it's bad. Again, you can do the same thing. I won't read through all these line by line, but you can do the same thing again with a group of documents. Give kids 3, 4, 5 texts, and then say, looking at these, write a question to help. Or what question would you ask for clarity? How can the documents be grouped? Again, you can turn these into multiple choice pieces for students. And I'll leave this slide up for just a moment for you to look at. But again, you're giving those students those different ways to engage in historical thinking, where the answers then are multiple choice. Respecting the idea that sometimes you may see 100, 120, 150 kids in a day, and I don't want you to abandon the formative assessments that would be necessary for a student to build the piece. And I've referenced this a lot of times because later on we're going to talk about document-based questions and doing a DBQ, and I love DBQs. And when I did the curriculum in Madison in my previous life, in the high school, we only did 2 of them. We built a lot more of these to do as kind of daily, weekly check-ins to build those skills along the way. So I'd encourage you to do the same. Don't do what I did when I taught an AP class and my kids every single Friday wrote a DBQ or an FRQ essay. And then I tried to grade all of them. That was insane. That's not how you should be practicing that skill. You should be breaking them down into those pieces, and you can do it both in short writing prompts and multiple choice. So what I really want to bring you into fun weekends, yes. I said the secret was, and there was some legitimacy to this, is I told kids, I was lucky I was in a small district, so my classes had about 15 AP kids. But I always say I never graded them in the first quarter, that I made kids grade each other. And I said that there was no way for you to understand how to write a good paper unless you understood how to grade a good paper. And so their first quarter grades were on their ability to go through the rubric to work with others, instead of work through that process with it. And it saved me some until they got along the way. Oh, thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I felt like that was a first step to doing that. They had to understand that rubric. But what I'm going to bring you to here is I think a different way and a better way to look at those multiple choice pieces in there. Because as you heard me give some examples, right? Some of you may have been thinking, oh, but I mean, that might be like that, what is the best answer? And so here what we have, this is from Bruce Van Sledderite. He was the bottom middle of our researchers page. He talks about weighted multiple choice. And so if you take a moment to read the question up here, the Mayflower Compact, the premier colonial covenant, is unique in that what I don't want you to do is just pick a letter, a correct answer. I'm going to give you a moment, and in the chat box, I want you to tell me which one of these is the best answer. It's a 4 out of 4. And then after that, I will ask you which one's the 0 point, and then which one's 2, and which one's 1. So take a moment to look through those questions or those answers, A, B, C, or D. Which one of those would you say is the 4-point answer, 4 out of 4, the best response to the question? The Mayflower Compact, a premier colonial covenant, is unique in that it ... What's our 4-point answer? And I see people dropping answers into the chat box. And everybody is agreeing that the answer is C. So here's where we start to differentiate things. If this was our traditional multiple choice test, we'd say, yep, that's the correct answer. Everybody who got C got the point. Everybody who didn't have C got it wrong. And we don't learn much about the students beyond that. So what you can do with a weighted multiple choice then is I'm going to go to the other end and I'm going to ask you which one of these is a 0-point answer. Which one of these basically fundamentally has no correct information in it whatsoever? And everybody in the chat box is saying B is the 0-point answer. Is there anybody willing to unmute yourself and tell me what are all of the things wrong with B?
0 collaboration.
Okay, keep going.
That was my share.
Okay. Anybody else? What's wrong with B? Leslie said 0 collaboration. I feel like we need to expand on that.
Well, they wrote it on the Mayflower. They hadn't even met the Native Americans.
So Karen, can I ask you, basically, in all of the words in B, in letter B, what's about the only word that actually truly is correct, quote unquote correct?
Pilgrims.
Pilgrims. Right? So a kid who picks that, like, we're probably doing the Mayflower Compact. So Pilgrims is the only thing. If there was not a collaborative piece, the natives were not involved, right? There isn't much to go in here. And we compared that with everybody saying C, right? And we would, and I could have asked if we'd gone deeper, well, you know, like the tenets indicative of self-government, let's look at the Mayflower Compact, let's that. But I'm actually less concerned with people picking the 4-point answer, because what I want is, okay, if the whole class gets the 4-point answer, great, we're done. I'm gonna move on. What I'm paying more attention to is, what about the kids who pick B? What did I miss? Or what, if I'm doing this as a pre-test, as a pre-assessment, what did I miss with them? What do I need to let them know? If, and I'm sorry she's not here, we talked about this before and I got my sessions wrong. Beth Ratway did the session about closing or minding the COVID gap last week. And one of the things she really talked about is pre-assessments when you're coming back in and where are kids at and what do they know? And I think this is something like to be pulling into your classroom. If you are coming to the Mayflower Compact and you look in your book and you're like, I have 3 days for this or whatever that type piece is, and you give them a pre-assessment and every kid gets the 4-point answer and gets it, do you teach that 3-day lesson? And I think as teachers, we struggle to give that up because it's part of our lesson. So this would be a place to check in. And again, I'm not sure. So if I do this as a pre-assessment and everybody gets the 4 and shows that understanding, I would say then you need to be brave enough to then move on. We don't need to go deep into this. But what I really want to know is, and here's your tough question, okay? We need to figure out a 2-point answer and a 1-point answer. So the 2-point answer is partially correct with an issue. The 1-point answer has some truth there, but for the most part is not correct. So I want you to tell me what's the 2-point answer and what's the 1-point answer in the chat box. And let's see how much agreement we have. Uh-oh, we've already got some controversy. We've got two people who flipped them. Kate says the 2-pointer is A and the 1-pointer is D. And Karen says the 2-pointer is D and the 1-pointer is A. Beth said that A is the 2-pointer. Leslie says she needs to reread the compact. Nate is on Kate's side. Kate/Beth should not be picking sides. Should not be saying it that way. Nate says that the A is the 2-pointer. So what I would want to do in here is we see a little bit of a split, okay, and maybe it's only one person, but starting to think about what's those differences, or what's the difference? What's the difference between A and D? And more importantly, if a certain percentage of your students, if you were to say, what's the 4-point question? And a third of your class, a half your class says that it's A, what does that mean they understand? And what does that mean they don't understand? Because we can talk about how you should adjust your instruction. And can you do it in a way that says, okay, well, these kids had C as the 4-pointer, so they've got this level. These kids picked A, which means I need to help remind them of this. These kids picked D, which means I need to remind them of this, and these kids picked B, and we need to start at the beginning, right? So what is the difference if a kid, let's just say, is anybody willing to unmute and talk? Those who said A is the 2-point. What did the student understand, and what do they still need to know? Since they did not pick C, what's that missing gap? Is anybody willing to take that on?
Well, I just said it because it's true, but it's like way down the line. So it's like they're thinking too far ahead. They're not really understanding what's going on in the moment.
So
I'll tell you why I put it the way I did. I'll tell you why I gave it a 1 and not a 2.
Sure, absolutely.
I gave it a 1 and not a 2 because they had already separated from the English crown when they moved to the Netherlands. So when they decided to go to North America, I don't think they were thinking much about the British crown per se. They were just thinking about their religious freedom. But then I started thinking about it a little bit more, and then I decided, well, they did form a new government that wasn't like the British crown. So there, that's my explanation.
And would Kate, Beth, or Nate, anybody who put down A for 2 points, would you like to respond to Karen's explanation of her thinking?
I guess I can. By moving to what was supposed to be Virginia, they were going back under the rule of the British Crown. So, I mean, I never even considered arguing they moved away from England by going to Denmark, but by going to the New World and eventually settling in Massachusetts or Plymouth, they are back under the control of the British.
Well, they were contracted with the London Company to get there. So that was the only way they could get there. So they didn't really contract with the British government to go there. They contracted with the London Company.
But you could argue that the London Company got its power from the British government.
Well, that's true. So that's my thinking.
The British government does turn Massachusetts into a royal colony.
So if I'm a kid, do you think I understand anything about the coming of the Pilgrims?
I'm not sure, but I was just about to thank you and Beth for participating, because I now know a lot more about what you know and how you're perceiving what you know, as opposed to saying, sorry, you didn't pick C, so it's wrong. And I would encourage you, like, if you're going to do something like this, like, weighted multiple choice are hard. They're hard to write. You're not going to churn out 100 of these a day. But if you put them in the right spots and you give this to the class and then say, okay, guys, put down your 4, your 2, your, okay, write them out. Now, here's the answers. It's C, then A, then whatever it is. If you picked something other than what I just said, on the bottom of your page, explain to me why you thought otherwise. And then I would want to read what Karen had just said. Beth wouldn't get to respond to Karen, right? But I'm checking to see where you're at. And I'm getting into those pieces, because I always say when I do this, I'm just listening to you guys talk, right? Tell me why 4 is the best. Tell me why this is a 0. Tell me why. And I'm getting an insight that out of a multiple choice exam that I do not get out of the traditional multiple choice exam. So think about this as a way to work with those kids, and be brave. If all your kids get the 4-point answer, you can probably skip ahead. And be strong enough, if you finish a unit or finish a section or finish an activity, if you do the Mayflower Compact and you give this and the kids don't pick C, go back, redo it. Right? The same way I would say, well, I've got it scheduled for 3 days, so I better teach it. Because you might have to say, well, I had it scheduled for 3 days, but I need to go back for a 4th because they missed it. And you can check in with this piece, right? It's not that end of the unit, I'm going to give you 20 of these. But if you really think the key idea of understanding that the Mayflower Compact is important enough, you're going to spend a couple days on it, you could do that quick little pre to see if this is something that they need the time on, and you can do that post. And if you're willing to lose a day here or there and skip it because they already know it, that will give you those times to go back. But it's a really deep evaluation piece. If every kid, and this is why we're talking about formative, not summative, if every kid failed this after your 2 or 3 days, would you go back and reteach it? Would you, or would you say, oh, I'm sorry, we've got a schedule to teach. You guys need to do better, pay closer attention. Who gets that ownership in that? And so again, there are ways to buy you time by pre-assessing, and there are ways, because it might not, you wouldn't start over again. I would hope you wouldn't start over and be like, well, I taught it for 3 days and the kids didn't get it, so I'm going to reteach those 3 days. I would look through and say, okay, well, most of the kids were picking A. So what I need to do is help them bridge the gap from A to C. You've identified that piece, right? You don't just start over. Because again, if you do that George Washington Mickey Mouse, and if every kid picks Mickey Mouse, you have no idea what they got wrong. Even if they all pick James Madison as the first president, what does that tell you wrong? So do you stand in front of the room for a day and say, George Washington was the first president, George Washington, write it down, right? You start to layer in some of these pieces. And again, they're tough to do. But one of the most interesting experiences in my professional career in this position is we were meeting with Bruce Van Sudwright, and he was going over this, and he had this question up on the board. And he asked us, it was the room of me, right? There was 25 or 30 state social studies specialists. And he said, what's the 4-pointer? What's the 2-pointer? What's the 1? What's the 0? And one of the most fascinating conversations to watch was to watch people argue 2 and 1. Exactly what Karen and Beth just did. They argued it with Bruce. They're like, we think you did it wrong. He's like, no, we went out, we tested, right? Just like any other standardized test. They had gone through and tested it out. But to hear the brilliant minds arguing the nuances of 2 and 1, it's like, yep, this is a smart room. But it gives you that level of understanding that you don't get in the traditional format. Yes, Kate says you could set it up with Google Forms so that if they don't get the 4-point answer, they would be led to a screen where they had to explain. Yeah, and then you could go on. So then the question that I often ask, and I quote Connie Hamilton, when you ask a question, are you looking for the right answer or good thinking? If a kid doesn't get the 4-point question and then they explain it, could a kid give an explanation that was better than them just getting the 4-point answer? And I would say, yeah, I want to know what the kid's thinking. And so if you want more, again, there's going to be the link in there, Joe will have access to the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. They have a group called Arch that they have a bunch of these where you can go in and play. They don't have a ton, but you can see some pre-made examples in US history. There's some weighted multiple choice. So this whole section was about arguing that multiple choice can still be used. We just have to know why we use it. So looking at speaking and listening, Diana Hess, who did a session with us last week, she talked about controversy in the classroom and having difficult conversations. She says, part of our job is to teach young people how to talk with one another, especially with people who have differing views. And the teaching channel has stuff around structured academic controversies. We did have Paula McAvoy. If you want to check out her webinar that we did, she's the co-author of The Political Classroom with Diana Hess. She did a session about how to do structured academic controversies. Otherwise, there's some additional links in here. But one of the times that I was meeting with Diana Hess is we said, well, what do we do at the state level? How do we support this? And she said, find a topic, a state topic that's controversial in your state, but will never be addressed at like a national level. Because you can go look up structured academic controversies. You can find them. In the workshops I often do, was Abraham Lincoln a racist? Somebody has put together that structured academic controversy already. So in working with the Maine State Museum, the Archives, and the Holocaust and Human Rights Center, we built a structured academic controversy around Malaga Island. And since we have a pretty small group, I'm not going to send you into breakouts. So we have 2, 4, 6. We do have 8. And some of the readings can be, actually, tell you what, let me send you in the breakout rooms just so you have a moment to talk and come up with a plan. And then we'll come back. So what you're going to do is I'm going to assign you one of these readings and give you just a little bit of time to play with it. And what you're going to have to do is you and your partner, I will either say that your answer is yes or no, and then you have to be ready to come back and lay that out. So the question is Malaga Island an example of state-sponsored racism? And now normally what you would do in a whole structured academic controversy, you'd probably spend a day, an entire class period, you'd be reading all 4 of them, and you would be assigned yes or no, and you would be looking for all of the evidence that supports your side. And then we'd come back through the process. To shorten it up because of the situation, the time, and all this other stuff, I'm just going to have you look at one document and just one side, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'll assign you out to the rooms. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Before we get started, I want you to note just a couple key things. This is when teachers talk about having difficult conversations or they worry about having difficult conversations. This is the first place I take them, is the structured academic controversy, because it's structured, it's going to be timed, and I provided that evidence for you. So I brought in those pieces for you to look at. If we were doing this in person, I would ask that you point at the text. So in this case, I'm just going to trust that you're actually kind of quoting back to something to the best of your ability. But this is not an opportunity to say, oh, well, I kind of heard this, or I think that, or maybe somewhere. So it's just that evidence-based piece in a structured environment, timed out. It's not an argument. When one side is talking, the other side is listening. And what I really like about this in speaking and listening is it's both equal parts. After the one side speaks, the other side has to repeat what they heard. It is not a free-for-all. It's not an argument back. So here's how the process is going to go. Yeses, and I'll just for simplicity's sake, I'll say the breakout room 1. I'll say those who read Gloria Harrison. I'm going to give you, and I'm really compressing this down for time, I'm going to give you 30 to 45 seconds or so to just lay out your reasons why from what you'd heard. And then what I want is group 2, the Lewiston Evening Journal group. I want you to tell us what you heard them say. And group 1, if they misheard anything, you can correct them. No, that's not what we meant, okay? And then group 2, you will tell us the no. Group 1 will tell us what they heard. Group 3 will tell us their yes. Group 4 will tell us what they heard. And then group 4 will tell us the no, okay? So everybody know what group you're in to start off? Okay, so I'm just gonna start out. We're looking for just 30 seconds or so. Don't have to be super long, very abbreviated. Group 1, in the Gloria Harrison interview, what did you hear as evidence that this is an example of state-sponsored racism? And Group 2, be ready to tell them what you heard. So go ahead, Group 1.
So we've decided this is definitely an example of state-sponsored racism for economic reasons. This family that has been forced off their land had to live in a boat because they were evicted from family land.
Okay. Group 2, what did you hear them say? And Group 1, if they misheard anything, feel free to let them know.
They were moved off their land for economic reasons and they had to live in a boat.
Group 1, did they hear you correctly?
Yes.
And they were a family.
Yes.
Keep in mind, what you normally do in something like this is you're probably looking for like 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes of speaking time with like a 45-second I heard you. And again, we're just going quickly and you only had part of the evidence. But again, see that structure, right? You got to speak to your evidence piece and then they had to repeat what they heard. We want to make sure they actually heard you correctly before responding. Now, Group 2, you're going to go ahead and tell us your no. What did you find for no in the Lewiston Evening Journal? And I want to note, they are not replying to what they heard. They are still just laying out their evidence. So Group 2, go ahead. What did you find for no from the Lewiston Evening Journal?
We found that the state of Maine owned the land and that the people that lived on the land seemed to be very prosperous. They had their own school. We learned that they thought maybe the state would let them stay. The Lewiston Sun didn't give any background information about anything about why they had to move or anything like that. So we say because the state owned the land, they had the right to do whatever they wanted with the land.
Thank you. Group 1, what did you hear?
Okay, I heard that the state owned the land and I believe that the people who lived on the land were prosperous because they had a school.
Okay. Did they hear you correctly, Group 2?
Well, they did have a school, but that would make sense because it would mean that the families were able to afford to build a school. So yeah, that's what I said.
Okay. Group 3, the August 1911 Malaga Island. Your evidence why this, yes, was state-sponsored racism.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. Part of it, it talked about the governor wanted to, I'm trying to refer back to my document. The best thing to do was to cleanse by fire, to burn every building excepting the schoolhouse on the island. So they thought that that was like the best course of action rather than trying to help the people or give them aid, just to burn it all down.
Okay.
I would also add that the people that lived there were referred to as half-breed, poor human wretches, and that nobody wanted to take responsibility for her and her being the island.
Group 4, can you tell them what you heard?
I heard that they wanted to burn it all down other than the school, and that it was an island of half-breeds.
And that it was the governor wanted to cleanse by fire.
Group 3, did they hear you correctly? Okay. Group 4, from your executive council report, why is this not state-sponsored racism?
So we looked at the report and they were proposing to move certain families off the island in order to save money. And they have a list of some of the families that they wanted to keep on the island. And so some of the families that they wanted to keep on the island were white, and some of them were listed as a quarter black, or so there was sort of a mix of different types of people that they wanted to move on and off the island.
Group 3, what did you hear them say?
That it was a mix of people, so it wasn't just targeting one specific group.
Group 4, did they hear you correctly?
Yes.
And so this is very, very basic, right? And we only did kind of one round, but we kind of have 4 people on the side of yes, 4 people on the side or no. We would time things out. Everybody would have been given more time and more evidence, right? You're kind of coming in very light on that. But notice, like, some of those key parts of that is you were not rebutting each other. You were not going back and forth. It was just a statement of your evidence to make sure that all the sides have been heard. And you could repeat this multiple times. You could time out again, like, okay, now round 2, we're gonna go back in again and give the yeses more time to lay out their cause, and the no's more time to lay out their causes. You could change it up and then say, okay, now in this round 2 or round 3, however we want to do it with yeses and the no's, you could say, now you can directly address, I heard Meg say something. That's why we're confirming what we heard. I heard Meg say this, and according to this, my piece, that contradicts that. Because this first time I was not letting you rebut each other. It was just the reading. You can build in a round of that where you can address those type of pieces, specifically rebut, and then going back to your evidence. Paula McAvoy shows her process, right? There's different ways. You could also have people argue both sides. Okay, so now group 1, what did you find for no in your evidence, right? There's different ways to approach it, but what we continue to see is the structured piece. You're working off of the evidence of the information that I brought you. And then depending on the grade level and comfort level, then at the end, a lot of times you could say, okay, now let's lose the yeses and nos, whatever side you were assigned. What do you think? You've heard all the sides now. What do you think? What's your answer? And you could have them do that verbally or that written piece. But when you structure it through in this, you're providing that information. It's an evidence-based claim that they're making. It's timed out. You're alternating sides. I mean, think about all the worst things that you think about a debate and how we're trying to take those parts, take those different away. And so Beth says, yeah, definitely take, I don't know if she's talking about Malaga Island or the structured academic controversy, but I would encourage you to watch, and I have it again linked in. Do I have my screen share still up? Yes, it is. Okay, so I do have it built into here. That Paula McAvoy did go through and model in piece. She has these great video clips about what's actually the difference between talking and discussing. Like we have links where people are engaging back and forth, and she's arguing they're not really having a discussion. They're just taking turns talking. And how do you support this type of stuff where we actually engage? One of my favorite ones to do, as I'm still kind of keeping this idea, is if you're going to have kids engage in this type of work, the speaking and listening, make sure you're having them do the listening component as well. And what I really like, and I will give my full disclosure, although I liked it before I started on the board, I saw Thinker Analytics do a presentation, and I talked with them after and gave some ideas. We did some brainstorming back and forth. But full disclosure, I do sit on the advisory board for Thinker Analytics, the group that you're about to see here. But what I really like is I think if you understand the idea of argument mapping, I would suggest you have kids do argument mapping before they do a debate. And the same way, like we just said, point at the evidence, I would want to know what they're coming to the debate with. And you can look through these argument chains, right? Like how they should be approaching it. And you can have kids listen to the debates and argument map what they hear. So I want to give you those little things. It's something a student can make to prep for a debate, and it's something students could write down as they heard a debate. So I want you to watch here as we debate Tom Brady. And let me make sure if I can get a quick thumbs up as soon as it starts to make sure that I know everybody can hear it, I would appreciate that. Ready?
Okay, now I want to show you how argument mapping can help us talk about really controversial political and social issues. You ever watch people in an argument or get in an argument yourself where it feels like people are just talking past each other, like they're not really responding to what the other person is actually saying, right? And you're not really getting at the source of the disagreement. And you've probably seen this if you've ever like been on the internet or watched a presidential debate or been on social media, and it's very frustrating. And a lot of times what's happening is that people have unstated assumptions or hidden co-premises that they're not actually saying out loud, but that's actually where the source of the disagreement really is. But argument mapping can help us expose those hidden co-premises so we can see where people really disagree. So let's do an example here. Now this is a pretty controversial political topic, so hang on to your seats. And I'm sitting here in New England, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and people are trying to convince me all the time that Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time. He just won another Super Bowl, right? So my friend will usually say something to me like, yeah, Brady is the greatest QB of all time. That's his main claim, right? And he'll give me a premise for why I should believe this. It's usually something like Brady has won the most Super Bowls of any quarterback of all time, right? He actually has 6 of them now, which is totally insane, right? Now, I'm from Colorado, so I'm not so convinced by this argument, and I'm a fan of like Peyton Manning or John Elway. And I also remember this thing called Deflategate, right? So I'm not so convinced by this argument. Now, the problem is that if I start talking about how Brady's actually a cheater, then I'm not actually responding to my friend's argument, right? Because his premise here is about who won the most Super Bowls, and this is actually just like a true premise. So how am I supposed to actually disagree with him without actually just talking past each other? I want to actually respond to what he actually said. Well, you might be able to see that there's actually a hidden assumption that my friend has. There's a missing co-premise here that connects this first premise to the main claim. And that hidden co-premise is that winning the most Super Bowls is what makes you the GOAT.
And I'll pause there, I'll go back to it. But this is what struck me as I sat and listened to them present, is they keep talking about how we talk past one another. And I think this is such a great example, is how many of our arguments that we have, we're actually arguing about hidden co-premises. And since we don't talk about the premise itself, that's why we can't agree. So the issue is not, is Tom Brady the greatest quarterback of all time? What this whole debate really is about is winning the most Super Bowls makes you the greatest of all time. And if you can't identify what the actual crux of the argument is, you will just continue to talk past one another. But now watch how students can build an argument by building out the rest of the map.
That's what's going to connect this first premise to the claim above it. Now, one thing to notice is that in MindEmUp, I can actually label that this is an implicit co-premise with this button right here, and it actually makes it kind of a dotted line around it. So that lets me see that this is something that my friend didn't actually say, but I filled it in order to make his argument make sense. Now, take a look and you can see that this is actually a very strong argument, meaning that if the two premises are both true, then the main claim just has to be true, right? If he's won the most Super Bowls and winning the most Super Bowls makes you the GOAT, then he just has to be the GOAT. So if I want to disagree with his claim, which I do, then I have to disagree with one of the premises because I can't accept both the premises and then end up, disagreeing with the claim. So obviously this is the premise that I'm going to want to disagree with because it's just a fact that he has won the most Super Bowls. So the premise that I want to disagree with is about what makes someone the GOAT. And this is the heart of the disagreement because we're really arguing about what makes someone the GOAT and not about who's won the most Super Bowls. So I might place an objection, right? I might say that winning is easier when you have a great team and a great coach, right? Like Brady did, right? Or I might also say that winning is easier when you cheat, right? Just saying, it is a lot easier, right? So these are objections that I might make to this premise. You could come back and support the premise. You could say like, well, the Super Bowl is the crowning event in football, right? So That would be a reason to believe that winning most Super Bowls makes you the GOAT. I just want you to see that this is really where the heart of the disagreement really lies, but it's something that my friend didn't even say initially. So all of that is just to show you how exposing hidden co-premises can help us talk about more controversial issues. And a lot of arguments that people make have underlying assumptions that they're not actually saying out loud. But with maps, we can actually expose those, and then we can take a look and ask, is the argument any good? So now's your chance to practice doing some exposing hidden co-premises.
And I won't walk you through all the stuff. I'll show you where you can do some more of this. But I think it was Karen who said, but he didn't cheat, right? And so then you would build off of that piece. There was no this. And what I really like is the visual about how it starts to lay out. We actually know what we're debating. We know we're debating it's related to the most Super Bowls. And then Karen, he made the point about cheat. It's easier when you cheat. Karen said, well, no, that he didn't cheat, right? So now we can focus in. We're not just randomly throwing out pieces of information. We're trying to work off of different pieces. And so when I started working with him, I said, well, this is great, but I don't think people can understand an argument map till they build an argument map, but I don't think they can build an argument map till they know an argument map. So they created this interactive video. So as a group, either in the chat box or unmuting, we're going to go ahead and build one, and I'll show you what this looks like. Oopsie.
Hi, my name is Tondo, and I'm an intern here at Thinker Analytics.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm also an intern at Thinker Analytics, and today we're going to help you make an argument map.
The question is, do you think that controversial issues should be discussed in the classroom? If you do, click on me.
If you think controversial issues should not be discussed in the classroom, click on me.
Do we think controversial issues should be discussed or should not be discussed? Yes, okay, so we'll go with that.
Great job. The main claim is that controversial issues should be discussed in the classroom. Now we have to support the main claim with the premise. Why should we believe that controversial issues should be discussed in the classroom?
So which of these three things support the claim that we should discuss them? Is it the first one? We should discuss them because biased teachers could unfairly influence students' opinions? Should we discuss them because discussing issues will help students develop critical thinking? Or should we discuss them because discussing issues could damage relationships between students? First, second, or third?
Two.
Nate says second. So we drag it over, we check, and we got it correct.
Great job. Now, which of the following gives us a reason to believe that premise?
Okay, so now we're addressing this question. We're working our way down. Discussing issues will help students develop critical thinking skills. Is this because our country is more divided than ever? Critical thinking skills are important for success in life, or discussions require students to analyze arguments on both sides? 1, 2, or 3? Leslie says 3. And I would like to point out before I check it, actually I'll hit check, that's correct. But 1 and 2 are not incorrect. But 1 and 2 do not directly support the claim above it. And this is what I referred to earlier as an argument chain. You're building your argument chain that way.
Great job. Now we need to choose another premise. Which one of these gives us a reason to believe the main claim?
So what else supports this? 1, people can get offended when you talk. 2, discussions will prepare students for the real world. 3, students spend more time in school than anywhere else in their lives. What's another reason why controversial issues should be discussed in the classroom? People are saying 2. You're a genius.
Great. Now let's support that premise with a sub-premise.
So which of these supports this real world? 1, the world is full of controversial issues. 2, it's time to get real. 3, schools should focus more on science and math. Nate says 1.
Great job. Now we need a co-premise. Which of these connects our premise to the main claim?
So we're talking about discussing issues prepare students for the real world. What's the co-premise in here? Studies show that discussions are more effective than lectures. Some people are afraid to talk about controversial issues. Classrooms should prepare students for the real world. What makes discussing issues for the real world relevant to say it should be in the classroom? And Nate says 3.
You made a great case for our side. Controversial issues should be discussed in the classroom.
So this is just a very, oh shoot, I was hoping they would keep it up. So what you see here is there's 2 ideas about why we should be discussing them. They develop critical thinking skills, and schools should prepare students for the real, or that this will prepare them for the real world. But that only matters if we agree that students should be prepared, or classrooms should prepare students for the real world. And then you're starting to build out these argument chains. And again, the reason I like this is if you have a student do this ahead of time, if they've got argument chains in certain areas with 2, 3, 4 supporting pieces, and then other areas that don't have supports, I want to make sure they're addressing the ones that have supports. A student should not be trying to bring up something that they didn't have the support on, right? So if I'm watching the student engage and they say, well, X, Y, Z, and there's no support, so why did you do that? Because I can see according to your argument map, you don't have any support, right? And I think a lot of times we throw things into discussions that we don't have support, but it's the gotcha moments or the yes or the no or whatever. And so you could have students prep this ahead of time to see where all of their evidence lands. And you could have students just listen to the argument and then track. Was this a co-premise? Is this a supporting claim? Is this a counterclaim? Can a student listen to a debate or an argument and map out where people are saying? And what you just participated in, if you haven't seen it before, that was an ed puzzle. You can take any video and embed questions. So the video stopped and we had to answer the question to continue. And then it told us if it's right or wrong. So especially if we're thinking about like a flipped classroom or distance learning, you can assign videos to kids, to your students, and know that they didn't just hit play and walk away. That they had to answer questions along the way and you would get those. And if you want more information, Richard Byrne and Caitlin Tucker have really good resources about using Edpuzzle. So this is a more fleshed out piece of what it could look like. And you see the different subclaims. And right, so this one, like if a student came into here and this was empty, I would want to know, why did you go over this line of attack that didn't have a lot of information? This one, you had a lot more related to it. And there's a link in, you can see what the whole argument map may look like, and they give you the different levels, your thesis, the session, the topic sentences and claims. And so when I heard them present, one of the things that they do is they have kids draft this out and then it becomes their essays. That you pull those pieces out to set up your essays. But I really like it in the idea of debating. And I keep referencing this chain of support, so I want to take a moment to look at this, because there's a fun little activity in here that I think drives home the point. Is okay, so we're looking at our argument. Can we visualize the structure? And again, that's why I like the argument mapping, so we don't just go in blind. Single premise, independent premise, etc. So a single premise, most arguments have more than one premise. So it says try mapping this argument. And I'll skip ahead. We should get rid of the death penalty since killing someone is never okay. And furthermore, the death penalty does not actually deter crime. So there's 2 premise that's supporting the main claim. Let me move it to present mode, I'm sorry. And so this is how it's graphed out. There's 2 separate premises. They're independent from one another. They are not related. They're not connected. And so they give you those separate reasons. Somebody can agree with either of these and still agree with we should get rid of the death penalty. You can have as many independent claims as you want. So then another one, social media platforms undermine your privacy rights. They can also be highly addictive. Therefore, you should limit your social media usage. So again, main claim, 2 premise. So we've got single premise, we've got independent premise, but now we're going to work on those chains of support. So we're back to, we should get rid of the death penalty since killing someone is never okay because all people have the right to life. And so we talked about these. But notice they build on each other. They're not independent. The word is because. Killing someone is never okay because we have the right to life. These are not independent premise of each other. They're starting to build out your chain. Killing someone is never okay. Why? Because all people have the right to life. This is how you work your way down. It's always a series of why. We should get rid of the death penalty. Why? Because killing someone is never okay. Why? Because all people have the right to life. And that's how you start to build out this chain. That's what a student's argument should look like. And they should be able to develop out longer chains of support with a lot of independent premise from each other. If they really believe that we should get rid of the death penalty, there should be multiple independent premises that all have supporting sub-premise. You can just keep going. All people have the right to life. Yeah? Why? Because the right to life is fundamental. You're born with that right. Sooner or later, you do eventually end because you start to run out of those whys, right? We get to the point like, okay, we can all agree on that piece. But a student should be able to build out these sub-premise. And so our little activity you can do in the chat box is I'm going to read these 4, and you need to identify, are these independent premises from each other, or is it a chain of support? So the first one I'll do for you. I should go to Jamal's Halloween party because Halloween is my favorite holiday of the year. Also, lots of very attractive people will be there. These are independent premises. The 2 premises are Halloween's my favorite holiday and attractive people will be there. They are not related in any way, shape, or form. Number 2, I'll ask the group. We are failing the female community by nominating Chris Brown for prestigious music awards. This is because he has beaten past girlfriends like Rihanna, which we know because he pleaded guilty to assault charges. Are these independent premises or is this a chain of support? You can either put it in the chat box or unmute. Margaret says it's a chain. It's a related chain, right? He has beaten past girlfriends. Why? How do we know? Because he's pleaded guilty. These 2 are connected. The pleaded guilty supports the Rihanna piece. Next one, fair trade companies promote positive business practices in the agricultural sector. They pay workers in developing nations a fair wage for their labor. Thus, I should buy grocery products that are certified fair trade. Are these independent premises or a chain of support? It's a chain. We're saying I should buy grocery products that are certified fair trade. Why? Well, they promote business practices in the agricultural sector. Why? They pay their workers a fair wage. They link together. Last one, children shouldn't be allowed to play Call of Duty. It promotes violent tendencies and children could be using that time to do more beneficial activities such as exercise or reading. Is this an independent chain? Okay, we've got it. Margaret already jumped in. It's independent, right? It promotes violence and they could be doing different things. Those are completely separate. Those are separate from each other. And so then those are the answers for that. And so this would be an activity I would want kids, if you worked with kids to be able to do this, to build out, and you can see it around controversial topics. Racial segregation is unconstitutional. Again, you start to see. And if you go to their website, they have free classes where you can get a better understanding. They do little learning modules, and they do have some of these built out again. So there is how to get started with MindMap. That's the mapping tool that they use. And then again, you can also learn more about argument mapping and thinker analytics. I want to go into that. But I like that idea of when people are speaking and listening, right? We saw it in the structured academic controversy, and we saw it with argument mapping. It should be opportunities to where we're being able to record and keep track of our arguments and what the other people are saying, and we should be able to put all those together. If half the class is having a discussion, the other half should be able to fill out the graphic organizer for structured academic controversy or the mind map that they're listening to, or the argument map that they're listening to. And the people who are actually doing the debating should and could have done that ahead of time as well for your own piece. I'm going to, so we're looking at some online resources already do a lot of this stuff. Educating with Evidence is a group that has a lot of pieces, Southern Illinois University and the Library of Congress. It looks at students can cite evidence to support a claim or corroborate arguments or identify a main idea in the source. And I talked about, like, there are places that have some of these multiple choice. So for example, multiple choice can be done well. Educating with Evidence shows that. If you're thinking about your topic, and we've been talking about the Civil War, if you see here, the standards are the Common Core for reading, writing. So if we want them to cite, and for social studies, if we want them to cite evidence, if we want to practice citing that, you can give them a letter. I suppose I should double check. I do have the right screen up, correct? Can somebody give me Leslie says go Salukis.
Yes, more SIU. Yes.
And I have the correct screen up then, Leslie, while you're on?
Yes, you have the best screen ever.
Thank you. So this one, and Leslie, this would be perfect for you, 6th grade. You can give students the letter to John Brown, Mrs. Child to John Brown, and you can still see some of the reading informational 6.6. Based on the above primary source, which statement best states the author's support of John Brown? And your answer key is right here. It's A. But it's not like one of those memorization pieces. They have to then read the letter. They have to understand where the author's coming from and what John Brown wants in order to do that. And then it's the asking what quotations from the source best supports. And we kind of talked about that earlier, right? These are all quotes from the reading. This is not something that a student would come in and being able to memorize or guess. They're going to have to read this piece, think about one, and then try to contextualize the quotes. And so they have where you can get the information, background on John Brown, the source, and then the answers. So what we've done there is that's a reading. We're multiple choice assessing a student on their ability to read historical thinking and Common Core standards. Right? It's multiple choice, but it's not just who is the first president. So you can still get deep into that. And then I had time set aside for you guys to go check it out, but we'll move on at that point. So that's a great resource, again, that's done the multiple choice. I talked earlier about Joel Breakstone and his historical assessments of thinking. And you'll see him at Chega's Beyond the Bubble. And we'll watch their little video here.
Imagine if real-life decisions were like a multiple-choice exam.
First question. To surprise the British troops in Trenton, should I, A, dress my troops up as a marching band and offer to play a free concert, B, hide my troops in a giant horse and present it as a victory gift to the British, C, cross the icy Delaware in a rickety rowboat, D, stay in my tent because it's cold outside and let someone else deal with them?
Seems ridiculous, right? Essentially, that's what multiple choice tests do. They penalize kids for not knowing facts that are ripped out of context. On the opposite end of the spectrum are document-based questions requiring students to analyze and write a college-level essay based on 10 documents. But what if your students haven't learned to analyze one document, let alone 10? As an educator, do you have any other options? Now you do. Beyond the Bubble was developed by the Stanford History Education Group and unlocks the vast digital archive of the Library of Congress to create a new generation of history assessments. Our easy-to-use assessments capture students' knowledge in action rather than their recall of disconnected facts. We call our exercises History Assessments of Thinking, or HATS. HATS asks students to engage in historical reasoning as they critically examine primary sources. Most HATS take just a few minutes to complete and are easy to score. They also come with interactive scoring rubrics, samples of student work, and going deeper videos that extend your understanding of these assessments. Your students' short written responses to these HATS will give you access to what they are really thinking. Of course, there's always the alternative.
Are you sure we weren't supposed to dress up as a marching band? No, I picked A last time. It has to be C.
I'd have preferred D. I'm freezing. I think I got some ice in my knickers.
Everyone be quiet. I picked C and that's the answer.
And so what you see with them, with SHEG, which we've talked, we've heard probably me reference before, if you look at the Beyond the Bubble resource, they have over 80. And again, they're very short. And I love the piece in there about the two extremes, because when I first learned about history assessments of thinking with Joel Breakstone, like I said to him, like, this bridges the gap. I was trying to build curriculum in Madison and do the DBQs, but teachers who didn't do DBQs, the idea of 10 documents in a 5-paragraph, 3-page essay in 45 minutes, that's overwhelming. But if you look at some of these, a lot of them are just simple 1-sentence responses. And my favorite is the civil rights movement in context, because you have this letter, names and dates are taken out, and it's talking about the civil rights movement. And then the question would be, and I'm sorry, I'm not logged in. Is a student would read that question, or read the letter. Letter blank was likely written first because. So you've got the two little pieces in there. Letter blank was likely written later. And I say that if you read these two letters, if a student reads these two letters and doesn't know which one was first or second, then they didn't get the civil rights movement. Because the civil rights movement evolved over time from the 20s and 30s to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and we're asking for and saying very different things. And they're pretty clear in the letters. And so if you got to the end of that whole civil rights unit, for me, you could ask this one very brief little question and get your answer on whether the kids knew it. You don't have to do the full DBQ. You can do this famous photograph. If it loads. They give you the background information, the source information, the picture. Why might the background information above lead you to question the reliability? What is one feature of the photo that might lead you to question the reliability? And so these are all sorted out in what are you trying to get out of it. And what they do is they have these flagship ones that if you look in, like, oh, my kids need to do a better job of sourcing. My kids need to do a better job of understanding reliability. That if you go in and look at the Beyond the Bubble piece, you can see these flagged ones. And it tells you what it's really working on. This assessment measures students' ability to source a document. And then with it, they give you different lessons related to this. And they give you alternate versions of this assessment. So these are all the pieces that work on sourcing. So you're able to decide what's the skill I want my kids to work on. They have a flagship piece. And the great thing is, if you look at any of these, they give you student writing, proficient student writing, where the student zeroed in on accuracy. Emergent writing, where they were talking about the motivation of the artist. Basic, where they struggled with matching. So you can see what those different pieces were doing. As students were reading or viewing a primary source, what would they be writing to it? How should students be responding to this? So they give you the rubrics, all the assessment pieces, alternate lessons. And so that's if you are basing off of the flagged ones. because not all of them are the flagged ones, but they try to build them in. So if you go under sourcing, you see the flagged ones, but then some of them aren't flagged, right? So they don't have those extra levels. You can still do Louis XIV. There's still a piece to it. It's just not, you don't see all of those additional levels built out underneath like you see in the flagged ones. And so that's where I would break in a lot of that. Like, what is the skill you want your students to be working on? You can just work on sourcing for a while, just work on the corroboration, the contextualization. And some of those other skills are going to be overlapping. They don't work in complete isolation, but it's helping you focus on when students are doing some reading and then they're writing out that piece, what do you want them to do? And this is what you'd see all the way, and this is what I like to point out, this is why we had Dr. Montesano, because she was at the heart of this work 20 years ago and is continuing to do work today. This is the Teaching Literacy in the History Classroom, Sam Weinberg's latest book, Why Learn History. And I think some of you are participating in the book study in that. That it's not that memorization of names and dates that we started with, but it's that idea of students being able to read and write and process that information together. And I didn't get to come back in here, and just where I'd reference the Read, Inquire, Write webinar is posted online if you want to see their middle school work that they're doing there. You can access the Stanford History Education Group online. All their resources are free. The DBQ project is a group that we've partnered with them. Actually, in a couple of weeks, we're doing a training. We got some federal dollars to help do their online work. So that's a resource that can support that. And I love how we say, like, in the end, if you want to assess a student, if you really want the full exposure of knowing a student's got quality social studies, I love National History Day. If you really have a kid go through the entire span of National History Day, which takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work, like, that's everything social studies people should be doing, the way they're researching work, the way they're having to present their findings, the way they're having to read, write, interpret, speak, because they can participate in all sorts of different categories. And the research supports all of this. They can do documentaries, they can make videos, write papers, do a performance, build a website. And I really am. I'm such a big fan of, a group reached out to me one time and they wanted to interview teachers who were doing really good social studies. And I said, I'm hesitant to single out a teacher, A, because there's so many great teachers, and B, I'm not always aware of, you know, the work other people might be doing. So I directed them to John Taylor, National History Day, because I said, if you want to know what quality social studies should look like, it should look like this. At some level, it should do this. And whether or not you're having kids participate in a regional competition or a state competition, if you're still having them do those kind of key essentials in there, and I know that I have the choir, preaching to the choir here with Kate Kennedy, because she brings students there every year to compete. And I believe last year was the Maine NHD Teacher of the Year. So I don't know if, Kate, if there's anything you would like to speak to about National History Day?
I couldn't say enough about it. When I started with History Day, it completely changed who I was as a history teacher. And they offer a ton of great PD online as well, so you can learn how to be a better historian yourself. And they actually have you go through the process, so then you can, you know, impart that better to your students. But I would do anything for History Day. They are awesome.
Thank you, Kate. Anybody have any questions for me? And Meg, I do see them, or I will get you the note cards. I promise I found them. As soon as I stop the share screen, I'll grab them for you guys. Does anybody have any questions for me about what you heard in this session? And I apologize for going over time. Same one in here then. I do have the bibliography of text, so if you want to see the different research and the people and the authors and stuff that go into where I'm pulling the work from, I'll have that in there as well. I will go ahead and end the recording at this time with a thank you. Stick around, guys. I'll get you everything else that you need. But thank you for joining me today for talking Last Call Forum 2019, Assessments in the Social Studies Classroom for Speaking, Listening, Reading, and Writing.